To Pimp a Butterfly, Kendrick Lamar. To Pimp a Butterfly is on one CD, but it is essentially a double album. I have listened to it maybe half a dozen or more times, and I have researched it on YouTube and Wikipedia, but I feel I have only scratched the surface. I was not as blown away by early hip-hop as some were, as I'd already acquainted myself with dub reggae and toasting. I had a Virgin Records reggae sampler album with a number of dub tracks, and I played it a lot, and I dreamed of owning a Wem copycat tape delay, which one day I did. I was also not as appalled by rap as some were. I have never been one of those rock fans who claim to like all music apart from hip-hop. Of the early hip-hop that got played on the radio, I really liked The Message and White Lines by Grandmaster Flash, but I thought they were probably the best that it would get, and I did not predict any kind of future for hip-hop. I later quite liked Public Enemy, with their strong message and Chuck D's amazing voice. And I actually took the album by the Disposable Heroes of Hypocrisy out of the library because of the song Television, Drug of the Nation. But I've never been tempted to do any kind of hip-hop deep dive. If I like a hip-hop track, it is usually because of the samples or the production. I like Beyoncé's Crazy in Love because of the sample, much as I like the one that samples the Harlem Shuffle. I like the Kanye West track Power that samples 21st Century Schizoid Man, not just because of the King Crimson, but also because of the chanting. Often producers make samples do things they were never intended for, and they often create something that would never have been created if it had not been intended as a rap backing track. However, sometimes, dare I say it, I think the rapping gets in the way. It seems to me that to truly understand hip-hop you need some awareness of a mythology that makes Game of Thrones seem like the Three Billy Goats Gruff. It is like a 3 times weekly soap opera that I last checked into when Jay-Z played Glastonbury. I tried to watch Kendrick Lamar on the Glastonbury coverage, but I found the spectacle too distracting. However, I did watch the controversial Super Bowl performance, which I actually enjoyed. It was much less serious, and he seemed to be having fun with Serena Williams doing that crip walk. I don't study lyrics, and I don't need to understand everything. After all, I do listen to quite a lot of Italian opera. One of the things I like about Kendrick Lamar is that his cadences are not the same old rap cadences that I have been hearing, whether I like it or not, since the Sugar Hill Gang. One of the things the experts will point out is that in places he is performing a poem, but then it all sort of sounds like a poem to me, only some of it does not rhyme. On my first play of this CD, some of the tracks really stood out, possibly the least hip-hoppy ones. The first track on the album was quite interesting, but it was the second track that really got my attention. One of the reasons I bought this CD that I had heard he uses a lot of jazz, and on the second track he raps in a rather slinky way to real musicians playing real jazz. However, I did not find this that radical. I'm sure I've heard Shakespeare performed in a similar way. I'm sure the Beatniks recited Ginsberg to sax and bongos. This album was made 10 years ago, and in the last couple of years I have seen a local jazz combo performing jazz rap. With the inclusion of complaining female voices and the underlying theme of gang culture, it made me think slightly of West Side Story, but then I am often prone to comparing things to West Side Story. The next track that grabbed my attention was the song King Kunte. It uses the one thing that will attract a rock audience to a hip-hop track. Well, it is the one thing that will attract me anyway, and it is that Michael Jackson Billie Jean beat. It is probably the thing that made me like It's Like That and That's the Way It Is by Run DMC. One of the great things about this album is the backing vocals. And on the track King Kunte, they nicely punctuate Kendrick's fairly conventional rapping. Overall, I found that most of the earwormy bits that stayed with me were the backing vocal lines. The third track that stood out is the most obvious. The song is called I, and it uses a sample of Who's That Lady by the Isley Brothers. It has a very catchy chorus where he simply sings I love myself. On further listens, I found a very rocky track called The Blacker the Berry, which has an ascending keyboard line that builds to a climax as the vocals become angrier and angrier. It even introduces a rapper with a much deeper tone to bring home the message. I checked out a live performance to see if it really was a keyboard or real horns. On the live performance it was a keyboard, but he was performing with a fairly small band to a real rock audience in Austin, Texas. And the thing that really impressed me was the use of heavy guitar power chords to give the whole thing a bit more oomph. I also really like the track What a Dollar Cost, which has moody pads that remind me of Radiohead, and I'm also prone to Radiohead comparisons. There are some very complex exotic jazzy chords throughout this album. What a Dollar Cost has a slow, steady hip-hop breakbeat sample and a haunting line that sounds like something from a James Bond soundtrack, possibly played by Miles Davis. Most of the music on this album is not sampled but is played and sung by a wide array of very professional performers, each an expert in a particular style. The album is a tribute to all kinds of African American musical styles, jazz, funk and soul. He mentions and quotes all kinds of soul and funk artists. I spotted Michael Jackson and Smokey Robinson. Kendrick Lamar has a surprisingly high pitch to his singing and rapping, and for an old white English guy, it is actually quite easy to understand. Much of the rapping is very rhythmic and uses a lot of F and N words, but when he wants to be a bit philosophical, he slows down and enunciates quite clearly. Over the course of the album, he follows a pilgrim-like progress. It starts with him being given a lot of money, and he fears that he will fall foul of the tax man, just like Wesley Snipes. He negotiates his way through the traps set up by Uncle Sam, and he encounters God in the form of an old beggar, and he proves himself not worthy. He also encounters Lucy, a female version of Lucifer. He returns home to Compton and he finds out who he really is. Towards the end of the album, he discusses his African roots, pays tribute to Tupac, and explains the album title by finishing the poem over a Fela Kuti sample. I don't know enough about hip-hop to say if it is the greatest hip-hop album, but it is possibly one of the great concept albums. It is also probably hip-hop and rap for people who don't like hip-hop or rap, particularly rock and jazz fans. To Pimp a Butterfly, Kendrick Lamar.